All right, we're at 7:07. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We are going to get started on tonight's event. If we can just have everyone's attention toward the front of the room. Please feel free to phase out conversation at this point. Again, thank you so much for coming to our annual conversation. And with that, I welcome our president and CEO of the YWCA Greenwich, Mary Lee Kiernan.
Simone, and I am so pleased to welcome all of you to our 2024 Coretta Scott and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. annual conversation. And our purpose tonight and every year is really twofold. First, we seek to raise up an issue that those civil rights leaders would have fought for, were they still with us, something that was a vision, part of their vision of a just society. And we seek every year to mark this moment in a meaningful way, which for us means the continuation of their work in an authentic way that's relevant to the current context. Every year we put together an examination of a critical issue and a conversation about solutions that are forward-looking and productive, serving our YWCA mission of eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And our second purpose tonight is just to bring you all together because we want to re-energize you and recommit to equity and justice work. And we know that work is difficult, it's complex, it's challenging, and it's sometimes depleting. But we hope you will come away tonight making a new friend, gaining new ideas, and really receiving the nourishment in the community that it takes to move forward with equity and justice work. So our program tonight is entitled Bending the Arc, a conversation about inequity and access in Greenwich, echoing Dr. King when he said, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And those remarks were made at the National Cathedral in March of 1968. Tonight we will examine a group of chronic disparities based on race and gender that exist in our community and in our region. And of course, our community and our region are profoundly linked. And these disparities are well documented by Data Haven and other organizations, and will offer solutions on how to work toward a more just future. So, lots of thank yous now. Many thanks to our distinguished panel, starting with Mark Abraham, CEO of Data Haven, Dr. Lou Hart, Medical Director of Health Equity at Yale New Haven Health System, Yvonne Klein, founder of Fairfield County Talks Housing and the former Commissioner of Housing for the state of Connecticut, and Demetria Nelson, Commissioner of Human Services here in Greenwich. Their impressive bios are in your programs. And our moderator, who you already heard from, is Simone Coretta, the director of the YWCA Greenwich Center for Equity and Justice. We are so grateful for your participation and for what you do every day. Why don't we give them a round of applause? I would also like to thank the 63 community partners that worked with us, joined with us to co-sponsor and advertise this important event. Many of you are here tonight. We are so grateful for your partnership. Their logos are on the screen and in your programs, and they include houses of worship, schools, the Greenwich Police Department, hospitals, nonprofits from all across the community and the region, and of course the three other YWCAs in the state of Connecticut. And I love this image because what it really says is equity and justice work is systemic change work, and it takes a cross-sector and whole of community approach and collaboration. So thank you again to that group. Also partnering with us tonight are a number of our elected officials, and I just want to call out a few who are here. And I think Lauren Rabin was here or will be here for there she is, for the Board of Selectmen, Janet Stowe-McGuigan from the Board of Selectmen, the whole delegation for the Connecticut General Assembly, Senator Ryan Fazio, State Representative Steve Meskers, State Representative Representative Rachel Khanna and State Representative Hector Arzeno. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And we will now play a short video with greetings from Senator Richard Blumenthal and Congressman Jim Himes.
Hi, I'm Richard Blumenthal, your United States Senator and your neighbor in Greenwich. I've so often been delighted to attend YWCA events, and I know firsthand the amazing professionalism and dedication of the Y staff and volunteers under the great leadership of Mary Lee Kiernan. I wish I could be with you in person today, but unfortunately I'm stuck here in Washington. The Y today pays tribute to Coretta Scott and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s inspiring activism and ceaseless pursuit of justice. Today's expert panel honors their legacy by examining the causes and the extent of inequity here in Greenwich and the surrounding communities and what can be done to create equal opportunities. Now, there are a lot of popular stereotypes of Greenwich, as we residents well know. A town exclusively for the rich, a stereotype. Greenwich is diverse, and it's one of its greatest strengths that it is diverse, and it's important that we address the struggles so many in our community face every day. About a third of Greenwich families are one major unexpected expense, like a car accident, away from financial disaster. Nearly 25% of Greenwich public school students qualify for free or reduced lunch. Tonight's panel will endeavor to ensure that lower income residents here in Greenwich and throughout Fairfield County are given access, a fair shot at meaningful economic opportunities. I've been a long-time strong advocate for investments in affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, as well as the reestablishment of the child tax credit. Coretta Scott and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. saw economic justice as a necessary condition for Black Americans' equality and justice for them and all Americans. And today, obstacles to socioeconomic mobility are one of America's most challenging social issues. Unfinished work for America. And thank you again to the YWCA at Greenwich for furthering Martin Luther King's legacy and his life. I look forward to working with all of you to achieve more equity and fairness in Greenwich, in our state, in our nation. Thank you all.
Hi, I'm Congressman Jim Himes, and I want to thank the Greenwich YWCA for this annual Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. conversation. This conversation is really critical, especially as we've just observed Martin Luther King Day, and it's really critical that we don't lose the legacy and the breadth of Martin Luther King's aspirations and ambitions. Yes, we honor him for the remarkable work that he did in desegregating this country and providing for racial justice, but sometimes it's lost that Martin Luther King was extremely vocal on the Vietnam War, for example, in which tens of thousands of Americans lost their lives. That the day that he lost his life, he was in Memphis advocating for economic justice for sanitation workers in the city of Memphis. Martin Luther King, rooted in his faith, understood that the key to all of this is understanding the commonalities that we share, that there is so much more that we have in common than that which divides us, and understanding, of course, that we have an obligation to each other. If we re-acknowledge that, if we center that, we move towards the kind of just society that Martin Luther King spent his life and gave his life fighting for. So a big thank you to the YWCA and to the participants in this day's panel.
And thank you to Senator Blumenthal and Congressman Himes at a busy time for those remarks. So we will move along, and I want to remind everybody that at the end of the discussion, we will have a Q&A segment, and we're going to do this in a high-tech way tonight. And so we'd like you to use your phones and go to a site. It's on the back of your program, menti.com, MENTI.com, in order to enter a question and get it to our moderator. And we'll put that information, it's on the screen now, and it'll come back on the screen during the Q&A. You can ask the question on your phone during the conversation and as well during the Q&A segment. Now, if your technology totally fails you, let us know. Raise your hand during the Q&A segment. We have some staff here to help you, and we have good old-fashioned note cards and pencils if you need that as well. If you need to use the restrooms, we ask that you not use these doors on either side of the panel. That would be the best door through the gallery or that door. There's a men's room right back here and a ladies' room right back behind those two doors. So thank you again, all of you, for being with us tonight. And let me hand it over to our moderator, Simone Coretta. Thank you.
Good evening. Esteemed guests, esteemed colleagues, cherished members of the YWCA family and our wider community, I am grateful and excited to be the newly appointed director for the Center for Equity and Justice here at the YW. My aspiration is to help make the Center for Equity and Justice a local community impact center, one where people can come together while carrying on the tried and true work of community engagement, advocacy, shared learning, and systemic change. I want to give a special thanks to our community impact partners who Mary Lee made reference to, and all of my coworkers here at the YWCA Greenwich who made this event possible. Tonight we gather for an evening dedicated to education and exchange. We embark on a meaningful journey to provide greater context to the work we at the YWCA Greenwich do, the work our partners do, and to ultimately aspire beyond the limits of inequity and expand access. In addition, we celebrate Data Haven's 30th year, acknowledging the critical role that data plays in the absence of county government and the lack of indicators of inequity. We hope and we are confident that our panelists of esteemed experts and subject matter experts can speak to the issues that we've all invested in, cared about, and that bring us here today. So whether that's Commissioner Nelson's work to make sure folks in the town of Greenwich have what they need, or Mark Abraham's outstanding work in making sure we have the data we need to do the work, whether that is Yvonne Klein's work as a housing advocate to bring the center, the spotlight to those who need it when it comes to the issue of housing in Fairfield County, or whether that's Dr. Lou Hart's tireless work within the health equity initiatives here in the state of Connecticut. We have outstanding panelists here to close those gaps, answer those questions, and propose solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated health inequity, housing, and various other socioeconomic issues. And these are all issues that span through all various persons and people and background, but however, I think we all know, unfortunately, due to systemic and historic inequities, that the intersection of race and gender is often too close to conversations about inequity. All these components of social determinants and individual community well-being that we seek will be fulfilled, I hope, through action, community building, and education. We focus on the topic areas as well to honor and cherish the work exemplified by Mrs. Coretta Scott King and Dr. King, who exemplified maturity, understanding well beyond their years in their lives, and continued the work of equity and justice. We continue to explore, learn, and discover more about their work, and hopefully we can do that through the work we do at the Center for Equity and Justice. But I would just like to say, and this is important and central to my identity, not just as a staff member here at the YWCA Greenwich, but as a Black woman, that it is important that we honor the man who stood beside the man and honor the woman who stood beside the man, and not just honor the woman as we think of her behind the man. And so it's important when we're gathered here to commemorate also the work of Mrs. King in her tireless efforts towards equity when it came to sexual orientation, gender identity, housing, and economic equity. So with that, I warmly welcome our first esteemed presenter, guest, and panelist who is leading the way in data curation in the community and is spearheading Data Haven's 30th anniversary year. Mr. Mark Abrams, the CEO of Data Haven, the floor and mic is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Mary Lee and Simone for inviting me to join this esteemed event today. You can go to the next slide. I'll start with a bit of an orientation. So at Data Haven, we focus on community-level information and neighborhood, you can go to the next slide, neighborhood-level information about well-being, equity, and quality of life in Connecticut. People throughout the state use the unique information that we collect and our data scientists produce to advocate for local needs and also to secure substantial local and federal grants for a lot of initiatives around the state. Second, if you're an agency, I know there are many partners here, you can reach out to us for free technical assistance in the use of data, just thought I'd mention that. And third, since 2015, we've completed 45,000 interviews in the state, including 900 randomly selected adults all throughout Greenwich. So if you think of Greenwich traditionally, maybe 9 neighborhoods, about 100 people we've interviewed in each neighborhood, and it's really like a probability sample to these interviews. So the survey produces very accurate data about local conditions that impact not just Greenwich, but also Port Chester, Stamford, every other town in Connecticut. So it's kind of a unique data source. It started in 2015, so not everyone's familiar with the data, and also as the survey continues, obviously statistically it gets more powerful. So I'm actually really grateful to Mary Lee and Simone for giving me the opportunity to dig down into the data for Greenwich specifically. We're usually looking at, Waterbury and Hartford and other towns, but to look at Greenwich in a more granular way has been really interesting for me, so grateful to you for that. And go to the next slide. The reports I'm going to mention today, you can get them on our website and download them. The Community Index is a 100-page book, so I just brought a few extra copies if anyone would like one. That looks at quality of life across the county. Health equity in Connecticut discusses some of the emerging issues that Simone mentioned around health in the past few years. And then the town equity reports, those are actually our most popular resource on the website. There's a report for every town in the state, and they have detailed data graphics and tables for each town. So those are really a new type of report we've produced that not just produces information on the town, but also drills down into differences by race, ethnicity in the town, and sort of disaggregates the data in some innovative ways that haven't been done before. Major funders of our work in the Greenwich area, I should just mention, have included Fairfield County's Community Foundation, Greenwich Hospital, Stamford Hospital, Norwalk Hospital, the Housing Collective, and the United Ways in the area. So we're really grateful to them for making this work possible. Next slide. So let's see, I'll dive right in. So the first question people have might be what did I find most interesting about Greenwich? What's most surprising to me in looking at this data? I would say one thing that really jumps out to me always is Greenwich residents rate their public parks really highly. So maybe not surprising to me. My grandmother actually lived in Greenwich for many years, and I've spent a lot of time here with my 3 boys, just kind of walking around Greenwich, going to the excellent public library in particular. The main library is just so impressive, and just walking around the town. So it's pretty clear to me why people would rate public facilities so high in Greenwich. But Greenwich is truly an outlier in this survey data on this measure. 98% of people say the parks are in excellent or good condition. You could see how in other parts of the state the numbers are much, much lower than that. The town equity report, you'll also find it shows Greenwich well ahead on other measures like child friendliness, people trusting neighbors. In Old Greenwich, I noticed 99% of people trusted their neighbors, so essentially there was one person who didn't, which I found interesting. And 80% of Greenwich feels safe to walk around at night, which is much better than the state average. These perceptions are really great. When we dig into Greenwich, we can see some variation in that. For example, Latino residents feel significantly less safe walking around at night in Greenwich. But overall, Greenwich is a great place to live according to that type of data. So I'll move on to other data now. So first, to better understand the town, the town equity reports look at demographics. You can see here over the past decade, the share of Greenwich residents who identify as people of color has increased from about 20% to 28% there. And that mirrors the changes you see in the state and the sort of area around Greenwich. Black residents are still significantly underrepresented in Greenwich. They're 2% of the population, and the share of Latinos is also smaller than surrounding areas. But Greenwich actually, looking at the Fairfield County as a whole, many parts of Greenwich are much more diverse than the county as a whole because of the mix of different populations, different housing types in Greenwich. Census data, I should note the census data also show that Black and Latino adults represent a large share of people who work in Greenwich. So up to 10,000 workers have commutes from places like Stamford, Port Chester, but also Norwalk, Bridgeport, Danbury, the outer boroughs of New York City, et cetera. So those are potentially stressful commutes getting to Greenwich. And we really value the looking at diversity, not just of residents, but also the workforce here. Next slide. So on average, as many of you know, probably Fairfield County has among the highest income levels of any metropolitan area in the world. It is surprising to see in the report that jobs located in Greenwich, if they're in the financial sector, the average income of those is about $500,000. Jobs located in Greenwich in the retail sector pay about $40,000 on average, so it's a pretty big difference. But even retail jobs and they tend to have higher wages than jobs in those same industries in other parts of the state. So overall wages are high in Greenwich despite these large disparities in income. So it's important to look at how residents do, though. There is all this income and wealth in the region. This analysis from our Town Equity Report looks at just full-time workers, age 25 and over, for both men and women. So men are the purple bars, and women are the blue bars here. You can see there's large differences in wages between men and women. Again, this is holding up even if you control for like education level, graduate degrees, occupations, et cetera. And that's true both in the state and within racial and ethnic groups. But the main takeaway from this chart for us is that there are much larger wage gaps if you look at these differences by race, ethnicity. So, for example, you could see white women in the Greenwich area earn about $90,000 per year on average. That's the blue bar over here. And Latino men earn about $45,000. So it's more of a wage gap by race, ethnicity than just by gender. It's very intersectional issues. I draw your attention to these because they really show why financial stress is so prevalent in the community. The cost of living in Greenwich would be many multiples higher than what you see from the income levels here. Food insecurity is the next slide. So this is kind of how it plays out. If you ask people directly, like in our interviews, do you have trouble affording food for your family in the past year? Many thousands of residents in Greenwich report that they face food insecurity. And you can see overall in the Town Equity Report, 9% of Greenwich adults report food insecurity, which is lower than the 14% rate statewide. But what's interesting about this is, when you break down these data, looking by neighborhood within Greenwich, for example, in Old Greenwich, which is the 06870 zip code, only 2% of people reported food insecurity versus 14% in the central Greenwich zip code, 06830, which is a mix of neighborhoods kind of around the center. Sarah, I'll get to that in a second. So it's a little surprising, to see that it's sort of 1 in 7 adults in many parts of Greenwich, given what we know about incomes and quality of life in Greenwich, that's an issue people face. Food insecurity is a very severe, issue that people face. Looking at race ethnicity, you can see 1 in 20 white adults in Greenwich report being food insecure versus 1 in 3 Latino residents. So just a very wide gap by race ethnicity. This is the data, and in the Town Equity Report, you'll see data for Greenwich often, but in some cases, the breakdowns are only available for Apuma, which is like a region around Greenwich. So it's kind of Greenwich plus some of the surrounding areas. In this case, it's just Stamford and Greenwich. But here I've broken down data like specifically for Greenwich. So you'll see sometimes the reports, cover data for the region, and I'm breaking it down a bit more here. Next slide. Adults who are food insecure also spend a considerable amount of their income towards housing costs. The Wellbeing Index shows that, Fairfield County, across like all these measures like life expectancy, income, education, Fairfield County really ranks at the top of counties in the United States. It's in the top handful on almost every measure, but the one exception is housing costs. So people spend a lot more on housing in Fairfield County than they do in the rest of the country. When looked at from a standpoint of like housing cost burden, severe housing cost burden is when you spend more than half of your total income towards your house, so your rent, mortgage, utilities, whatever your housing costs are. That severe level of housing cost burden is actually among renters in Greenwich. It's the same as among renters in Norwalk and Bridgeport. So renters here are paying, about a quarter or more are paying more than half of their income towards their rent. And as we know, rents go up every year. So that's a major challenge that we know kind of stands out in the data. And this also, if you look at household overcrowding or other measures, it shows up in there. Those are important predictors of housing vulnerability. So overcrowded housing is where like you have more than one person per room in a home. And you can see that really jumps out as well. This is one way to look at that, which is home ownership rates. You can see the disparity by race, ethnicity in the PUMA in this case. So it's Greenwich and Stamford combined. But I looked at it for Greenwich, it's similar. What stands out here is, for example, if adults who are white, 18 to 34, their home ownership rate, 28% of that population owns a home, which is actually, similar to older Black and Latino adults. So this issue of home ownership rates being higher among whites, 72% versus 28%. It's not just an issue of age, it's really like an issue of access to wealth and access to being able to purchase a home at that stage in life. And, that affects a lot of issues around like the racial wealth gap, housing being a main component of the racial wealth gap. So moving on, just have couple more slides around access to care. So you can see the rates of uninsurance in Greenwich are similar to Connecticut. 20% of Latino residents in Greenwich don't have health insurance. And these figures mask like even higher rates in certain communities. So if you were to disaggregate that further and look at immigrants, for example, or break it down by gender, the rates can be even higher than that. So that lack of insurance really restricts people's access to healthcare. It's why it's important to have healthcare services. These numbers have been improved greatly over the past decade because of the Affordable Care Act in Connecticut, but the survey still finds that just even people with insurance, they may have trouble finding the healthcare they need. Next slide. And then related to healthcare access, discrimination is a really important issue, not just like whether people seek care and get the care that they need, but how they're treated in the course of getting care, and also just as a source of stress in people's lives. So we measure discrimination in our survey, not just to know what the rates are, but because it affects your underlying stress, mental health, and physical health. Our survey found that experiences of discrimination are very common in policing, employment, housing, healthcare, and other areas. This is a chart from the index. You can see just within the past 3 years, 16% of Black adults in the county reported employment discrimination. And you think about like the civil legal needs and our legal infrastructure being very limited to address those sorts of concerns. When I drilled down into the Greenwich, like the town data specifically, I found 39% of Black and Latino residents in Greenwich reported healthcare discrimination at some point in their life versus 3% of white residents in the town. So again, thinking these wildly different experiences of different communities in the town are important to understand. And we can see, from this healthcare data, the index gets into like a lot of nitty-gritty issues around health and all sorts of health conditions, but we know Black adults in Greenwich in particular have much higher rates of adverse birth outcomes, early onset of chronic diseases, and also in some of the communities in Greenwich, there's much higher rates of poor mental health outcomes, so like anxiety, depression, we can see that in the data a bit too, and you're thinking about targeting services can be important. So to conclude, this graphic summarizes like some of the topics we include in our survey interviews. The main domains that affect our well-being, we think, are civic life and sort of social connections. That's the top one here. Health access, your health status, really, mental health, physical health. And the third one being economic inclusion, economic security. Those are the three things that really contribute to like how well people feel they are, how happy they are in their lives as we measure well-being directly, because everything kind of relates to well-being in some way. So the first domain, you can think about all these things in Greenwich that contribute to that, like the high-quality parks I mentioned. Greenwich seems to stand out there having a lot of those assets. For the second, local health disparities, again, you could see looking at the local health data for Greenwich that issues like access to care and discrimination are really important. These have a major impact on people's lives starting from birth, so addressing those now can have a major impact later on in people's lives. And then for the third domain, I presented the data on food insecurity. I think it's kind of surprisingly high, I would say, in parts of Greenwich. The Data Haven survey and national surveys, really found during the past few years that food insecurity dropped dramatically during the months the child tax credit was active. I know that was mentioned earlier. So during those 6 months when people were getting checks for each child from the federal government. Food insecurity, poverty dropped by as much as 2/3. And then right after the credit expired, in Connecticut, they doubled among families in our survey, and in some of the national surveys, they went up even higher than that. So that was an example of sort of a policy that had a major impact on that third domain of well-being. And then the other thought that relates to the theme of the panel tonight is around demographics. You can see that's something we measure here. We ask people in our survey, a lot of detailed questions about their family history, incarceration history, all sorts of characteristics and ways that they identify. So why is that important for understanding quality of life? When we talk about these things like measuring race or sexism, we're not just really measuring like people's identity. We're also asking about that because those are really proxies for racism and how people have been affected. So as people currently experience life, their identity is shaped by the environment around them and racism that they've experienced, but also the legacies of social policies like redlining, racial covenants that prevented people from moving to certain parts of the state. Other race-based decisions, our country, of course, made many race-based decisions, you would argue, over time that really, so when you measure race, what you're really measuring is the impact of racism on people over generations. So in conclusion, I'd invite you to imagine like if every part of the town, every part of the state had the same level of access to these areas of resources, social and material opportunities, and what the data would look like for the county and for Greenwich if that were the case. I think the whole town, the whole region would be just, much more prosperous than it is and a better place to live. So thank you.
Okay, we are going to move into our discussion portion of the evening. Mark, thank you again for your presentation, and again, congratulations on the 30th anniversary of Data Haven. So as we start our discussion, I kind of want to just dig a little deeper. So if we're looking towards solutions, and thank you for giving a comprehensive and quantitative presentation, right? How does Data Haven engage with local communities in the data collection process? I know you made a brief mention to that, but could you expand upon that? And how do you continue to do the work to make sure everyone is reflected in these reports?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
just bring it closer to you.
Yeah, a lot of the data collection that's done at the federal level, as our reps know at the state level, there's always a lot of concern about making sure groups are represented well and not undercounted. So the statistical experts we rely on for a lot of this data at the Census Bureau, they do just a tremendous job ensuring that the data is accurate. We can do that too with our survey, just testing it repeatedly, putting in a lot of effort to reach different communities and doing sampling so it's not just a convenient sample of like whoever wants to respond. It's really like intentional about making sure we interview people in every type of community in the state. So that's important. There's a lot more that can be done, like making surveys available in like many languages. Unfortunately, some of those things, like the cost is just really high. So that's a limiting factor, not just for our survey, but for a lot of the state and federal work as well. But accessibility when it comes to data collection is important. I think what's really important, though, is like not just to collect the data and have it go into like a compendium or a database, but to really work with organizations like yours and town residents to understand the data. So that's where, Data Haven's a fairly small organization. We could use all of your help to, share the data out to use it effectively. So building those partnerships is really key.
What are some other areas of opportunity you have when you collaborate for data collection with community partners?
Well, we like to work with like libraries to reach, residents and try to figure out, how to assist smaller organizations in like building up their services and having the same access that like a larger organization would have.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much. And we then move to Commissioner Demetria Nelson. And to start, Commissioner Nelson, you've done a wonderful job in your role as lead of our human services here at the town of Greenwich. And to start, I wanted to kind of gauge, and I know you have some supplemental material of your own, and this material will be shared with those in attendance here. after our event. How does your work sort of intersect with what we've learned from Mark's findings tonight?
Yes, so I definitely see the same trends that you mentioned in the clients that we serve. Currently, we have about, for FY 2023, there were slightly over 1,800 households within Greenwich that accessed our services, which ended up being about 4,250 individuals. And in terms of the neighborhoods where they were accessing services, primarily, it was in line with the data that was collected that you have, and also Greenwich United Way in terms of the needs assessment. So those areas included for us Chickahominy, South Center, Pembroke, and Byram. 70% of our population that we serve are from those 4 areas.
And what is probably the most concerning if you had to pick a demographic overlay? How does that intersect with the most pressing needs you see?
Yeah. So in terms of the clients that we see, approximately 37 are 65 and older. And we have 45% of our clients identify as Hispanic or Latinx. So we're seeing that those are the major needs within our community.
Thank you for sharing. Mark made reference to accessibility. I'd be curious to know how much language barrier or residents who do not speak English as their first language or are foreign-born, how much does that impact how you're able to not just deliver services, but get the information about services out to them?
Yes. So for us, the majority of our clients, the second language that they speak is Spanish. So all of our case managers that we have both English-speaking case managers, but we also have case managers, social workers that are bilingual in Spanish and also in Portuguese and also in Haitian Creole. So, and we also have a language line. So we know that there are other languages where it may be a barrier for them. So we instituted that language line about 1.5 years ago. It's kind of challenging to interact with a client when you're using Google Translate, but for a while that's all we had, so we used it. But we looked at our budget, and luckily the need arose right when we were planning our budget, and we were able to get the funding for it. And we're seeing that in terms of the languages that we're accessing for that, Spanish, Portuguese, and then those are the 2 highest, and then occasionally Chinese, Ukrainian, and other languages.
Thank you. So we've spoken about accessibility and language, but there's another barrier to access, I think, that gets overlooked, and that's the access to digital equity, whether that's bandwidth access because someone may not be a digital native due to age or generational bucketing. So how does that impact your work, and how does that kind of affect your ability to do your job effectively?
Yeah, so I was looking when I first started working for the department as the commissioner, there was CDBG funding that was out there that was COVID related. And we saw that there were a lot of resources for students related to technology, and also there were some resources that were related to the older population. But what we saw for us, that there was a gap with that sort of middle, level for those individuals that needed access to technology in order to attend remote, appointments for either mental health or medical, attend and enroll in school. So we were able to secure funding to be able to provide those devices, and we were able to partner with our Commission on Aging to help to continue their funding to address the digital divide for the elderly. And right now, we were able to secure that funding through ARPA, and that will go until the end of 2026.
I think that's a very useful best practice for other towns and their commissions of human services as well. We heard Senator Blumenthal make reference to this in his greeting video, that there are misperceptions about Greenwich. There's a Greenwich that people think of when they think of the word Greenwich, and then there's the reality. And I think in your role, you're probably interfacing with that reality a lot more. So how do the stereotypes around Greenwich negatively impact your work? And to be a bit edgy, how does that make your work easier in some ways?
Yeah. So in terms of, I don't know if it's necessarily a negative impact, but there's a lot of education that has to happen initially to let people know about the demographics of the town, let them know about the the large disparity, between and the large range of the various incomes, and then looking and identifying of what a working wage is in Greenwich versus in other municipalities. And people are always so surprised to hear that we have public housing and that, we also have affordable housing. This is something that is known to everyone that works and lives in Greenwich, but it's really, educating others to know what the various circumstances are locally.
Thank you. And just to kind of follow up again, in some ways, how does the misperceptions or access, frankly, make it easier to provide need for your clients?
Yes. Once that education occurs, then people are willing to want to help. And in Greenwich itself, we are resource rich, right, in terms of the number of nonprofit organizations that we have that can provide assistance to our clients and the various services that are coming in. And I'm glad that, for instance, there's when we had Wheel It Forward that is in Stanford, and they were able to engage with us, and then we can now increase the access to durable medical equipment for our clients that would otherwise not be able to afford it. It's just absolutely amazing in terms of who is willing to come in to partner with us and fill the gap and fill the hole that they didn't know was there.
We're going to pivot toward our solutions-focused portion soon, but before we do, I just want to ask you, obviously, our mission here is always to eliminate racism, empower women, and the intersection of gender and race, and we've spoken a lot about the overlays of that. But I think in reading the Data Haven Well Index report, it was interesting to note that the most vulnerable population, specifically in Fairfield County, are women of color who are single mothers and live close to the poverty or ALICE line, even with the lens of the Greenwich income threshold. So how does that sort of impact how you work, and specifically, where are some gaps that you feel you need to fill because of the overlay of those identities with need?
Yes. So in general, I just want to throw out the statistic that 77% of the households that we serve are led by a female person who identifies as female. So, and speaking to you, what are some of the challenges and barriers and gaps that we need to address? We are a municipality, right? And we're open during business hours, 8:30 to 4:30 for us. And that becomes prohibitive for some people. So we really had to look at the ways that people were accessing our services. And much like everyone else, we were able to do, virtual visits with clients, visits also by telephone, but we also can go out and do home visits. And we have implemented within the department a policy where if someone does have to meet after hours, we have someone that can stay, with them for safety reasons. But we really try to be as flexible as we can, considering what we're working with.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will pivot toward Ms. Yvonne Klein, who will speak to us about housing and housing equity. Again, thank you, Mark and Demetria, for answering our questions as it pertains to not just statistics and data, but how that overlays with the services. So, Yvonne, you're on the hot seat. No, I'm kidding. So just to kind of jump into things, we have some key data points here, but you have a very rich history with housing advocacy, and I just want you to provide a bit of context to your subject matter expertise and the roles that you've held, not just at the state level, but locally, to give some context to your knowledge.
Sure. So if I can jump into our first slide here, I only have a couple of slides, but I think this first slide really sets the stage and is demonstrative of the direct line that zoning has to segregation, thus fueling the inequities that we see not only in our state but also in our county and trickling down to our local communities. So the first point here is Connecticut and Fairfield County. Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation, and Fairfield County is one of the most segregated counties in the nation, and this is all supported by data. Fairfield County has the second highest income inequality. We dropped from being number one last year, so we're getting a little bit better, right? And Fairfield County has one of the largest achievement gaps in the nation. So I think when you look at this information, it lends itself to creating the context. And I think we have a local slide that, usually when I go into communities, I really take time, and Greenwich is easy because you're a neighbor, to learn about the communities. But, here's a snapshot of Greenwich. So you've got almost 25,000 units of housing in Greenwich. And of that 25,000 units of housing, 1,388 units are deed-restricted affordable housing. And, so that's about 5% of your housing. So, what this data tells us is Greenwich could do better. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Greenwich. We're polite in Fairfield County, if nothing else.
Thank you.
So this data demonstrates, as I said, starting off the direct line that from zoning to segregation. And when we look at Greenwich and we look at the surrounding suburbs, Greenwich and, I'll talk about my hometown, Darien, we're about the same when it comes to the percentage of affordable housing we have. So Darien, we've got about 4%. So out of the 7,400 units of housing or homes that we have in Darien, 281 are deed restricted. So even though Darien has gotten some notoriety for making progress, which we have, and I'll talk about how, again, we still can do better to meet the needs that exist in our county and in our state. When we look at our neighboring cities, Norwalk and Stamford, Norwalk has 13% deed-restricted affordable housing, and Stamford has 15% deed-restricted affordable housing. And as we saw and as we see on this slide, and Mark also mentioned this, Greenwich is a very white community at 74%, but Darien is whiter at 88%. So Darien is less diverse. So again, comparing that to our neighbors, Norwalk and Stamford, Norwalk is 51% white and Stamford is 49% white. So what you see in those two cities is really a nice 50-50 in diversity, which, clearly more diverse communities are, diverse race, ethnicity, culture, age, gender, make for more, really make communities thrive. And being a former chief elected official, that's what you want. You want your communities to thrive and to grow. Armstrong Court, Greenwich just received 9% tax credits for Phase 4 of Armstrong Court, so you'll be bringing on more affordable housing in the near future. Darien has built more housing and more affordable housing, so those numbers will be counted in the 2023 report. So you'll see those numbers go up. It's no secret multifamily and affordable housing applications in front of P&Z bring out all the objectors, okay? So all of us supporters need to become as vocal as the objectors. And when, we take time to analyze what's happening in our communities, zoning is the thing that is the key to change in our communities. And there are a number of ways to do that. And I have to say, first up, I'm going to look to locally elected and appointed officials that you understand and know the facts about affordable housing and zoning and all those tricky questions that come up, because there are a number of myths. So if you've ever watched or attended any of these public hearings on affordable housing, folks repeat those myths. Elected and appointed officials repeat those myths. So it's our job, as whether you're appointed or elected, is to learn the facts, and to learn the facts of what state statutes truly are and what zoning regulations put forward and truly mean, and the effect they can have on a community. So I'd like to jump to best practices, if that's okay,
that's
Simone. And then I'd like to reference a couple of things. Oh, you know what? Let's stay with this slide, because what is always a notable number is the number of homes that have 3 bedrooms or more in our communities. In Darien, it's like 6,000 out of the 7,400. In Greenwich, it's 17,000 out of your almost 25,000. That's a lot of homes that a lot of people cannot afford. And, you know, whether it's the folks that work here and who have to travel from Danbury, who can't afford to live here, because we got a lot of homes that are very expensive, and the low rates of home ownership among people of color reflects the continued inability to create generational wealth. So, you know, we start to put all these things together. It's really important. So, some best practices, and how can communities do better? Zone 4 and build more multifamily housing in our communities. So 22 municipalities in the state of Connecticut do not zone for multifamily housing, which is sort of interesting. This is required by state statute. It's the Zoning Enabling Act. I won't get too wonky, I promise, but it's the Zoning Enabling Act that gives municipalities the authority to zone, create zoning regulations, create zoning boards, planning boards. So in the Zoning Enabling Act, municipalities are required to zone for multifamily housing. They are also required to provide housing for low and moderate income individuals and families. So that's the requirement that most municipalities could do better at. So some things that we've done, so in Darien and here in Greenwich, you zone for and you build multifamily housing. So that's great. About 30 municipalities, and I think it's growing, are implementing inclusionary zoning regulations. And what those regulations do, there's usually a trigger. So in Darien, if you build more than 4 units of housing, you're required to provide 14% of affordable housing, pay into a housing trust fund, or build that 14% off-site. So that is something that a number of communities have, well, about 30 and growing, but it's really helpful to increase affordable housing. So municipalities were required to create an affordable housing plan. I hate to be judgmental here, but most of them are weak because they lack measurable goals. So in that plan, having measurable goals would be helpful. Encourage developers to apply for state funding to build affordable housing. Revise parking regulations. Studio and 1-bedroom apartments do not need 3 parking spaces. Lot size requirements, make them less restrictive. Some municipalities, should I name the town, Weston? 2-acre minimum lot size. Think about that. And build dense housing near transit for people of all income, otherwise known as TOD or transit-oriented development. So those are some best practices.
To that point, and thank you, Yvonne, for that, because that was incredible and very comprehensive. I want to kind of dig into what you were beginning to talk about, transportation access or the lack thereof of transportation access. How does that impact the work you do with Fairfield Talks housing, and specifically, how does that negatively impact people's ability to procure jobs and exacerbate the lack of economic development in certain communities?
So with respect to housing, we had done a Fairfield County Talks housing event, and it was focused actually on sustainability. And, we don't think about how communities form and how they grow. So what this presenter demonstrated, I think just reminded everybody, is that historically, housing and businesses were built around transportation. So for those of us who live on the coast, right, we had our ports, right? And then when rails were being built, housing and businesses were built along the rail lines. And we still see that today in our downtowns. You look at Darien, Greenwich, New Canaan, Fairfield. What's in the downtowns? Access to the rail stations. So importantly, you need transportation, and we used to call it the trifecta, right? As chief elected officials, we would talk about housing, near jobs, near transportations equal economic growth. So it's really important for people to, obviously be able to get to work, get to home economically and efficiently. So when we are not seeing bus lines, that really impacts people, especially people of lower income where they may not be able to afford a car. That presents a barrier to them to be more successful, to sort of move ahead in their lives. So transportation is really, really key for people's success, not only for an individual and family success, but also for businesses to thrive within our communities. The last thing we want to have happen are businesses not be able to attract employees because they have to drive 2 hours round trip to make a $15 minimum wage. Makes it very, very challenging for employers and employees. So the other part I will also mention is that building housing near transit, jobs near transit, is all good for the environment.
Thank you for that. I want to kind of circle back to something you mentioned, especially when you were giving us the contrast and the disparities between demographics and their relationship to housing. Mark made reference to this in his presentation, but wherever there are conversations about affordable housing or inclusive measures for housing and economic development, there's resistance. So I kind of want to break apart a lot of the microaggressive language that happens around redlining and housing. And so, Yvonne, I will lean on you. If there are phrases to your point about people misusing facts or presenting inaccurate facts, what are some of the key trigger phrases that people like to throw out to be in opposition to affordable housing?
So if you attend a public hearing for affordable housing, or I'm trying to be polite here, Simone, or multifamily housing, folks will get up and say, we don't want those people to live in our community. It's ugly. It's ugly. And I think this is rooted in classism and racism. They're just, people who live in affordable housing or public housing are lazy, right? So, and there are code words, affordable housing. It's just not in the character of our town. So character is a big word that gets thrown around, and I'm proud to say that Connecticut, even though it took about 4 years, I'm proud to say that Connecticut took the word character out of the Zoning Enabling Act and gave descriptive language to that. So I think it means a lot of things to a lot of people. So when I think about character of a town, I think about, is it bricks or clapboard? Like what is the architectural style of that town? So the word character means different things. And to the negative folks, it means not white. So that's the character of the town. So those are, I really want to stay polite, those are some of the things that get said.
We're probably touching on this, but what is the biggest point of frustration you have when it comes to conversations about not just housing, but specifically homelessness and the insecurity of having a home?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Could you repeat that?
Of course. So what are kind of the biggest frustrations you have in conversations about housing? I think we're seeing across the country and also in our communities these very fraught conversations. You made reference to them. But what are some of the biggest frustrations you personally have, just as a person? You've held various positions at the state and local level when it comes to the housing debate. What are people not getting?
I think the focus is too much on the bricks and mortar and not on the people. I also think that, and I can't help but bring in the work that I've done, that there's a lack of recognition for the folks who may not care whether or not people thrive and become rooted in a community, and their children do better when they're in a community like Darien or Greenwich. Maybe people don't really care about that, and they care more about the economics and the balance sheets of our towns, our county, and our state. I think that's the thing. That's where I get frustrated on those two planes. So if you don't care about people and you care about the economy, we should be investing in housing and the ability for people to not only rent but own a home, who may not have been able to do so in the past. And just sort of a fun fact about housing here, we have a 2% vacancy rate in the state of Connecticut and a 1.5% vacancy rate in Fairfield County. So my frustration is when I meet with elected officials and they wring their hands and they come up with all these reasons. So I'm not going to look at anybody because nobody said this. They're not necessarily, not these folks in the room, but there are folks who, they wring their hands, but we can't do this. Well, why? Why can't people of all incomes live in all of our communities? Give me a good reason, because I haven't heard it yet. So Simone, you spoke very well about how COVID exacerbated many, many things. I really exacerbated all of our weak links. But with housing, that's why you see such a low vacancy rate. You see homelessness is up. You see evictions up. When do we take action and say, you know what, we can end homelessness in Connecticut? We can provide funding and safety nets, which thank you for voting for. You did vote on something to expand the security for tenants, so we had some tenant wins this past year, but we've got to do more so that we have housing for people of all incomes in all of our municipalities, and that they're not just in very few municipalities, areas of low opportunity, and the cities. So yes, looking at the legislators sitting here, looking toward the legislative session, hope we could see more practice, but that's my frustration, is let's get housing and let's build housing for people of all incomes in all of our Connecticut municipalities. It can't be that hard.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for your wonderful presentation on housing. Lou, you have a tough act to follow. So, Dr. Hart, we are grateful for your leadership on health equity initiatives throughout the Yale New Haven healthcare system. So I just want to take the opportunity, we've spoken quantitatively, bird's eye view, we've spoken about services, and we've spoken about housing. But the lack of access or barriers, or specifically how race and gender intersects with this, also can manifest in health outcomes. So as someone who's on the front lines of health equity, and seeing the disparities, what are some of the causes of the outcomes? How do they interact with some of the factors we've spoken about tonight? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Awesome to be here tonight with you all. I love that question, because pretty much every time you have a multifactorial, complex, dynamic problem, I can always give you a simple, concise solution that's wrong. Because it always is a confluence of factors. And I think we focused on a few of them. We talked about this being a groundwater problem. There's something that's permeating, that's affecting multiple sectors of society. It's not just healthcare. It's not just education. It's not just criminal justice. It's not just child welfare. It's not just money and banking. It's something that's truly unique and within the fabric of our society. And whether we like that or not, I think a lot of that is due to our history. Luckily, I'm kind of an immigrant to this country. I was born on vacation in Canada. I'm a dual citizen. And I spent a good 10 years up there being really naive of being a black man or a black boy. I'm biracial. I grew up just Canadian. Our history is different. We have huge issues with how we've treated our indigenous people. But with the black-white racism, the Civil Rights Act, that's not part of our history. So it wasn't, literally, when I was 12 years old, I moved to New York City. It was a heck of a realization when people had assumptions about me, when they had just met me. You speak French, you must be Haitian. I don't think so. If you don't, you must speak Spanish, you look Dominican. I'm like, that sounds nice, but I'm from Canada. They're like, well, I don't know what you are. You must just be black. And I'm thinking, okay, this sounds great. Yeah, sure, I'm part of a community. This is awesome. And so, to get back to your question, when I think about, I kind of have the balance of looking at it from a healthcare specific lens, but knowing that that's a little naive, that very little of a person's destiny is related to the care within the four walls. The majority of someone's life is spent outside, at home, in the communities in which they've either been segregated to, how we've concentrated poverty in our country, and lack of opportunity, and then kind of questioned, how did this happen? Why are these outcomes so different? And it's kind of like, it's not that hard to look at objectively and see why it happened. But from a healthcare standpoint, I think health equity can be even the term equity, like DEI, probably everyone in this room has a different definition. And I think that's very scary. I think that's problemsome. I think that this has been polarized, this has been politicized, this has been turned into culture wars and wokeism around equality and justice. Like, where did that go wrong? Where did we go off on the arc that's leading us to justice? And I think that when I think about health equity, I think about quality and safety. I think about healthcare, doing meeting our patients where they are so they can live their healthiest life possible. And we talked a lot about what happens outside of the four walls, but now I'm going to talk within the four walls of healthcare. There's a history in medicine. Medicine wasn't invented overnight. It's a long and rich history with really, for lack of a better term, infamous forebears. There are certain parts of our healthcare system in the United States and even within our health system here in Connecticut where historically we have algorithms and equations that actually tell us to treat patients differently on the basis of their race. You're probably familiar with the kidney function tool, EGFR. It stands for Estimated Glomerular Filtration Rate. It's a simple blood test. We send it. It's the most commonly ordered blood test in our health system, a basic metabolic panel, and it predicts how well a patient's kidney function is doing. And up until August of 2022, at our hospital and our hospitals in our health system, we used to report out EGFR, African American, and EGFR, non-African American. So literally it was on the screen. And it was like my third week on the job coming up here, and I had done some work on this prior. And I was actually working in the emergency department at Greenwich Hospital, and I saw it, because we don't actually use it in pediatrics. We only use it 18 plus, so the only time I'll see a person that might be a little bit older is in the emergency department, sometimes on the floor. And I saw this very dynamic result that said if the patient was white, they were sick, but if they were African American, they were healthy. And I'm like, this is a fluke. Like, I don't really understand this, because in our country, African Americans have the highest risk of end-stage renal disease. They carry the highest burden of chronic kidney disease, yet the equation we were using made them look healthier. And really, when I looked at the data in the history of the studies that really came in the 90s, they were being objective. They were following data, but really what they found was a sicker population to begin with. The African Americans in their study were sicker to begin with. And they assumed that what we will now call a disparity was a normal difference, a biological difference in black bodies. And this is only 1999, y'all. Like, it's not that long ago. And so this famous study gets published. It's a very much easier way to capture someone's kidney function. The old way was to collect urine for 24 hours and then measure protein in it. Like, not a nice thing to do in modern medicine. So this was a game changer. And literally, here we are 20 years later, and it really took medical students, residents, really just prior to the murder of George Floyd, 2018, 2019, this started to pick up. And that was really when things were very much, this was a powder keg. But that's when, unfortunately, a lot of this change occurred, where our health system really examined the practice and looked at, like, it's not just kidney function. There's at least 15 or 20 other algorithms that take race into account. In pediatrics, we treat patients who are of East Asian race differently for hyperbilirubin. We used to treat kids who were coming in the emergency department for UTI differently, whether they were a white girl or black boy. This was in the algorithm. For medicine, we would treat people's blood pressure differently with different medications because they are, as the guideline would say, a black. And like, you're reading this history, and I'm like, am I like an alternative world? Like, this is dogma that I was just kind of force-fed in medical school. Never really had the time to question. I remember that one time I raised my hand, and I was like, Professor, like, this doesn't really make sense. Like, I'm half black, half white. Do you give me half the equation? Like, this kind of seems like voodoo magic. And they're like, I don't know. Stop disrupting the class because clearly, like, there's no good justifiable answer to what you do. It's not like it's race-based medicine. It's literally incarnate in our practice. So now we're the painstaking job of going through it. I've counted over 30 existing clinical decision support tools and algorithms. The downside is to get rid of one, you have to recommend something to take its place. I would say, like, when you're doing something bad, you should probably just stop doing it. But there's a lot of, we don't want to make things worse. So it's a very painstaking process, but we're about to roll out another one that we're eliminating. Kidney stone risk. The data showed that if you were of white race, you had the highest risk of having a kidney stone in our emergency department. So we have a guideline that says if a patient comes in with back pain and fever and it's been 6 hours, less than 24 hours, they're likely to have kidney stone. If they're white, they're really likely to have kidney stone. That's what the data showed. And so that was kind of part of our practice. For this type of patient, for a patient with these criteria, we could just give pain medication. We would have to avoid giving a CT scan. And the idea was we want to be judicious. We want to give CT scans to people who really need it. And so then my question to the authors, thankfully, we validated this study at Yale New Haven Hospital. So, like, usually the authors are around the country. It's hard to, like, pick up the phone and call them. This was, like, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in the emergency department. And I asked him, I was like, does that make much sense? Our, kidney stones seem to affect people the same across all racial groups, but why did our data show differently? And he didn't have a good understanding. And I said, well, what if, like, the black patients were just passing their kidney stones at home? Like, 96% of kidney stones will pass on their own. What if, because of bad experience, differential access, they just weren't coming in? Maybe they'd been treated differently the prior time, waited for 10 hours in a community emergency department setting. They just left. And the kind of light bulb went on. I was like, like, we might have not picked up that population and thus had been prioritizing or treating someone differently on the basis of their race. I think we would all say that's wrong. It was wrong 60 years ago. It's still being practiced in American medicine today. That's got to stop. I think it's tough when only doctors and nurses and social workers know about it. I think patients need to know about it because I guarantee you, if we were treating Jewish people differently because of their race, if we were treating people with blue eyes differently because of their eye color, we would say that makes no sense. But we're doing it right now with race and ethnicity, and that's terrifying. And it's happening to patients left and right. How we blow when we're checking our lung function, there's a race correction. There's a race correction. It says if you are white, you're normal, you have a higher bar to be normal. So what is called sickness for a white person is called health for a black person or an Asian person or a Latino person.
So what I'm learning tonight is medical racism is just medicine.
It's a historical practice, and a lot of our old history gets propagated until, and then the sad thing is, like, only 2% of doctors are black males. There were more black male doctors in the 1970s than there are now. I know of no colleagues in my health system. I know they're out there because that's what the data says, but I don't know them personally. And not that should matter, but it's, for some reason, I was the one asking those questions. That shouldn't have been my burden. That should have been any other classmate of mine. Should have been saying, like, whoa, what if this was like, you're hating on Norwegians or you're hating on American Indians? Like, that's wrong. So it speaks to a lot of opportunities to how we'll fix it, which we'll touch on in a second. But again, this is quality and safety. This is reducing unwanted variability in care. And when we're treating people differently on the basis of their race, explicitly, what do you think we're doing behind their back implicitly with all the bias that all of us as humans bring into the room?
So to that point, one of the pain points in medicine, especially in the zeitgeist right now, is the mortality rates and the birthing mortality rates for Black birthing people, specifically Black women. There's a long storied history around this. I think, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, due to very high-profile cases involving well-resourced Black women who happen to be celebrities, this has amplified the conversation. But how does that national conversation impact the work you do and the outcomes you're seeing in your work?
You know, and I also want to, unfortunately, have to call out the forgotten minority that is the American indigenous person. Like, talk about the ultimate, for lack of a better term, genocide. Like, it's a really scary history, and we've segregated them so effectively onto reservations that we don't see them. In Canada, we're really close with our indigenous people. It's a really big country, but we all live pretty close to the border. But in America, you very rarely, I lived in New York City, and they were like, there are 500,000 American Indians in New York City. I'm like, I've never met one. Like, how is this possible? And when you go to other parts of the state and the country. So the question, that was just me giving a call out to another group that is experiencing some of the highest rates of maternal death. Unfortunately, in our country, even white women have the highest death rate during pregnancy than white women anywhere else in the world. So and yes, our racial disparities double that rate for persons of color, but even white non-Hispanic women have the highest risk of death during pregnancy and after. And so any society that can't take care of its women during pregnancy is a broken society. I mean, this is like a basic low-level societal, social contract that I think we would exchange with each other. There's certain things we can do. Maybe I got to pay 0.5% extra tax to make sure that we don't have to worry about issues that are existing, not only on the margins of our society, but that are impacting everyone. I just today saw a family that was, my colleague came in on the obstetric side, and they were telling about the plan of care for that day. And they said, this is my plan. I'm going to stop this IV medication, and I really want you to be on oral medications. So that's my plan for today. And the mother was in a lot of pain, and she's kind of looking at me, and I'm the baby's doctor, so I'm just kind of there, but I'm kind of her doctor, because when I'm your baby's doctor, I'm kind of your doctor too. And I said, and she was like, well, but if I'm in pain, I want a new plan. And the doctor was kind of very rigid and kind of got a little offended by that. And I told the patient when her physician left, and I said, the plan is whatever you want it to be. If you're in pain, we change our plan. So this patient empowerment, patient engagement, patient activation, we're all paying for healthcare in this room out of our tax dollars, out of foregone income that could have been in our paycheck that our employers are paying for, or whether that's out of care, medical costs. We're all paying for it, but we just take what we can get. And some of us who have privilege can kind of work the system a little better. If I needed a neurosurgery, I could probably get one tomorrow. If I needed a primary care doctor to help me with asthma, it'd take 6 months. We have a whole bunch of issues in American medicine, and a lot of it will start with payment reform. That's long underway, and that's why I'm in business school right now, to try to hasten that process. But to the point around our maternal mortality crisis, I think we just have an unhealthier baseline population because of the way in which we concentrate lack of opportunity. Zip code predicts your outcomes much more than many of your other things that I can measure in your body. And we used to give pregnant persons Medicaid, and then a month later we would kick them off after the delivery. And then we were like, that doesn't make sense, let's do 3 months. And then now we do it 12 months, we give them a year, it's great. And then we kick them off. And it's maybe that's the reason why when a person's probably going to maybe get pregnant again, is coming into that pregnancy so sick with untreated diabetes or hypertension or heart disease, and then they die during or after, and it's actually the highest amount of risk is after the pregnancy, when we're kicking people off. Because your body changed a lot, and it's got to go back to what it was. And when we have broken access, you're not just picking up a call and calling a friend, you're in a waiting room in the emergency department, taking time off of work to worry about this headache that is really a stroke. So, I'm a much more optimistic and Pollyannish guy than I'm coming off right now, I promise, because I'm so hopeful in the solutions that are in place. It's not going to be easy work, but I'm really excited to hopefully play a small part of that.
Thank you. So you made mention of this earlier, and before we close in on our final questions, as you can see on the screen, you have your Menti functionality. So if you have questions, I advise that you please have them geared toward a specific panelist, whether that's Mark, Demetria, Yvonne, or Dr. Hart. And with that, we will have the questions to them in a way that's accessible. So feel free to start rolling in those questions as we wrap. But Dr. Hart, I was wondering if you could talk to us more about the We Ask Because You We Care initiative that you're working on, and specifically, what are some ways you can intersect from a solution-based framework with local municipalities, state government, and other data-driven organizations like Data Haven to affect equity in medicine?
So, like, interestingly enough, a colleague of mine at the School of Management told me, like, there's really two good ways. This is change management. So there's, like, two good ways to get people to do something a little different. You either persuade or you compel. So you can make a business case. You make it seem like it's worth their interest, that there's a vested stake, that we can grow this pie together for things that we couldn't do apart. And if that fails, then you can work with regulators and you can compel action. So this is a tricky one. In our health system, you see a lot of this demographic data. We get it from our patients directly. It's protected medical record. It's protected by federal HIPAA laws. It's kept with the same confidentiality as other medical history. But historically, thankfully not at our health system, patients didn't feel comfortable sharing their demographic. Are you going to treat me differently? I mean, clearly there was. But clearly they didn't need you to click at an Epic. They could have looked at you, unfortunately, by how we racialize people. So it's clearly very complex, but the We Ask Because We Care initiative is, I think, so special because it asks more than just traditional federal government race ethnicity. You're not just white, you're Scottish. You're not just Asian, you're Vietnamese. You're not just black, you're Nigerian. Because right now we just lump people into buckets and assume that you're going to play nicely into that. And we're really not ever going to get close to personalized medicine when we're just treating people in these broad population level buckets. And this is a step in the right direction. So every patient, every time that comes to our health system, at least for the first time if the fields are blank, is going to be asked to complete information on their race, ethnicity, their ethnic background, their language, whether they're experiencing financial barriers, transportation barriers, food insecurity, or housing insecurity. And we want to actually do something about it. We don't just think it can be our place anymore as a not-for-profit, tax-exempt organization and a pillar of our community to just prescribe you insulin or treat your hypertension. We actually have to understand what are those drivers that are causing differential opportunity, especially as it relates to health, and actually start to do something about it. We recently created an algorithm that predicts we have a problem in pediatrics. 1 in 5 of our clinic patients no-show. It's like 20%. Think about like clinical operational workflow. It's like really hard. So we created an algorithm to try to actually predict which kind of patient would no-show. You can see where this is going maybe. And because we wanted to double book a certain appointment. Because if we had to double book any appointment, we want to double book the one that we think is going to no-show. So we were careful not to use race, ethnicity, language, or disability. But we did use things like how far you lived from clinic, what your zip code was, whether you had transportation issues, whether you had a no-show before. And when you looked at what it also predicted, it also very effectively, this algorithm predicted no-shows about 2.5 times better than random. It wasn't perfect, but it was about 70%. It was pretty good. Better than random if I had to overbook. But it also very effectively picked a patient who lives in the zip code right next to the hospital, a patient who is African American or Spanish speaking or on Medicaid insurance. So like if we had used those as the risk factors, we would have never used this algorithm. So it just speaks to how scary this stuff can be if you're not paying attention and doing a close audit of it. But with the We Ask Because We Care campaign, back to that question, it really allows us to take a lot of, like there's community data, and we want to put that onto our healthcare data. To understand the investments we're making in our community and community-based organizations, are they impacting our patients clinically? Because if we're just blind to treating the clinical condition and not really blending, for lack of better terms, social care and medical care into healthcare, a more holistic approach to treating the patient where they are based on who they are and where they're coming from, as opposed to just saying, where do you fit into this guideline? Are you one of these groups or one of these groups? I just think that's a far-fledged approach. That's an approach that I think is a tired approach. And with the advent of a lot of these really exciting technologies like artificial intelligence or AI, it can be very scary, but I'm really excited because now no one can play ignorant because we're going to be able to disseminate so much information in real time. I'll get a report if I'm treating patients differently in real time. Who do you prescribe a 30-day supply to versus a 90-day supply? All these subtle things that I'm just in a busy hurry doing, I'll now have no excuse because in real time it'll say, Dr. Hart, you sure you want to do that? Because you tend to, this patient never received the standard of care last time. You sure you don't want to do it again? Those kind of nudges are how going to help us change clinical care until all of us can be a little bit more aware and just grow together. But I'm just really excited about what the future holds. But it's going to take so much work. It's not a single healthcare only. It's healthcare, it's housing, it's education, it's financial reform. But it's going to take everybody in this room here today.
Thank you so much for that. And let's give a sustained round of applause to the rest of our panelists tonight. Thank you so much. for your insights. And we will now move to the Q&A portion of the program, and we will start with Demetria. Being sensitive to the anonymity of your clients, what are some practical ways other Greenwich residents can be supportive of those friends and neighbors who access GDHS services?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think a way that neighbors can help is to be aware of services that are offered, communicate them, normalize the use and accessing of those services. To give one quick example, I know we collaborated with the police to develop a resource card. And when they go in and engage with someone within the community that might have a mental health or substance use issue or maybe at risk or dealing with homelessness, they provide them with that information so when they're ready, they'll reach out to us, even though they may not be ready in that moment. So all of you that are here tonight, you have a greater understanding of the services that we provide as a department and what's available within this town, and you've seen the need grow over time, especially with anything economic related and related to economic stability and housing, letting everyone know it is okay. The services are there. It's okay to reach out and access them and work on people not feeling shamed by that. We want to take away the stigma, and so just being ready, willing, and able to do so.
Thank you so much. Yvonne, a question for you. How can we change attitudes in Greenwich against multifamily housing?
Right. We always talk about, you hear nonprofits often talk about changing hearts and minds. I think there are a number of arguments to make. I think, there are two that I brought up this evening for the folks who really care about folks and people thriving. I think that's one argument to be made, and I think the economic argument is typically a very, very strong argument for communities. And I think having forums like this are really important because ensuring that people become educated about issues and in particular about the inequities that exist. And I learned a whole lot from you tonight, Dr. Hart. So I think having forums like this that educate folks and people can walk away with the facts to make some really thoughtful decisions. And as we've seen with the Fairfield County Talks Housing series, providing the education has begun to change hearts and minds with respect to this very difficult issue of housing and changing zoning to make our communities more inclusive rather than exclusive.
Thank you. We will close out with Dr. Hart and Mark. I just ask that you keep your answers a bit brief as we are currently running out of time, and that's not directed toward anyone. That is just generally. Dr. Hart, for you, you spoke about very passionately about inequity, but what are some ways normal, everyday citizens can help close the gap as it pertains to medicine?
Yeah, and then just one point I want to touch on that we ask because we care. We collect that data to make sure no one is treating you differently because of that data. And that's the kind of the nuance that I think people were lost on, and that's why it was such a great educational campaign to get that out to our patients. The question was, I'm sorry?
Oh. The question was, what can everyday people do?
Everyday citizens.
Everyday citizens.
So
yes.
I think the unique thing is, we all operate in a sphere or in a sector of the society or of the economy. And the hardest thing is doing it and only doing it within your sector or your whatever part of, whether that's your industry or whether that's where you live. We all need to reach out to something that looks different. For me, it was reaching out to DCF and actually figuring out that we had a really bad process and a disparity in our health system. We were drug testing black babies more than any other babies. And we found out that it was actually white babies that were the highest likelihood of being positive. So we were denying services to white families that were struggling with substance use disorder, and we were criminalizing African-American families that looked like substance users, even though they clearly weren't. So unless it was the healthcare system, us actually partnering with DCF, so that's what I'm doing in my role, but I would say that all of us can find, if I'm working in bank, what am I doing in housing as a banker? What am I doing in criminal justice as an educator? Finding ways to get across, not the aisle, but get out of your comfort zone, get out of your sector of society. I guarantee you that enduring partnership or the solution that you come together on is going to create such much bigger waves than if you just stuck within your lane. So that would be my recommendation. Reach far away, find something that's different than what you do, and see where you have a commonality. I guarantee you're going to get something done.
Thank you so much. And Mark, we will close on you. Final question. The town equity report for Greenwich shows that Coscob and Byram have high risk for air, toxin, cancer risk, and hazardous waste proximity. Are there ongoing studies following health outcomes?
Yeah, I think part of the theme here for tonight is all the overlooked populations. One thing that we overlook is the impact of air pollution, for sure, and the environment. Climate change is, this for young people at least, it's really arguably at the top of people's minds, and it's not an impact we'll see next year necessarily, but over time. So air pollution is definitely one of those things. It is like the leading cause of death, I think, globally, and it does affect our health, but it's not really something we can understand that well locally. Unfortunately, it's not. We're not really tracking impacts, or there's limited work to sort of reduce pollution from transportation, which is the biggest source. So those communities you mentioned, Byram, Coscob, those are probably the ones where there's more traffic from trucks and cars, and those are major issues. So the more we could do to reduce air pollution and reduce exposures, I think would have a huge effect on people's lives. It's just for some reason it's one of those overlooked issues, similar to how we sometimes look at immigrant groups and LGBTQ groups and domestic violence victims, and others are sort of just a little bit overlooked in the way that we prioritize issues or look at data sometimes.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you once again to our esteemed panelists. You did such a wonderful job. And now I will turn the mic back over to Mary Lee Kiernan.
Just very briefly, again, thank you all for being here tonight. Please do look at the resources that are on the back of your program. We will send an email out to you all in the next day or two with these resources and more, and a link to a video of tonight's program. And we do all invite you to our Stand Against Racism on Friday, April 26th at noon at Town Hall. We thank you again for being with us tonight. Take care and have a safe drive home. Thank you.